More than 50% of clinical decisions in today's era, in these days, are dependent on laboratory data. And laboratory values definitely influences clinical decisions, whether to start the therapy or to end it or to alter the drug dosage. So before going to the sample collection and how to transport it, let's briefly, I think by this time you must be well known, well versed with this web page. For those from non-clinical side might not be knowing. So this is a page in which you are going to raise investigation request, and here you can see department. So there are various departments in SGPGI in which they are doing laboratory investigations. And in each department, there are different service centers in which they are going to do specific testing. For example, in pathology, we have in pathology department, we have different service centers with, for body fluid analysis, for clinical chemistry, for hematology, for histopathology, for cytopathology, for electron microscopy and immunohistochemistry, and also for molecular biology. So let's go into the collection of blood, which is one of the most common specimen that you take out every day and send it for testing. The collection of blood, before going to the pointers on how to collect the samples, let's go into some scenarios. So day-to-day scenarios which you might have come across. Like in scenario 1, here a patient report, you are seeing a clinical chemistry report and showing hyperkalemia. However, clinically, the patient does not have any symptoms of hyperkalemia. So, what might be the cause? In the same, like in other scenario, there will be a hyperkalemia also, and associated with hypocalcemia and almost undetectable levels of alkaline phosphatase. Here also, the report is not correlating clinically, and you might think that there is some error at the processing end. Like the creatinine values suddenly are shot up from 0.7 milligram per deciliter to 1.8 over the course of last 8 months. However, his urine output or urea levels are quite normal. In a different scenario where platelet values have suddenly come down, the patient has complaints of fever and had been admitted in emergency, and first setup in the first investigation the platelet was around 4 lakhs, but in the second when you send it second time you might have got a thrombocytopenic report. So while there are no clinical symptoms or pointers to say there is any cause for thrombocytopenia, there might be similarly like elevated PT and APTT results, the coagulation values. However, the patient is fit and fine and there is no any bleeding from any side, any surgical side. So in another scenario where the heparin levels are consistently lower than the therapeutic levels, and you might be thinking to escalate the dose. So however, or you might be thinking the patient is not taking the drug properly. However, upon close inquiry, the patient is taking drug properly and his dosage is also fine. It is at the lab's end which are giving low results consistently. So in all the scenarios, the values, the lab reports are not matching with the clinical condition. So what might be the cause? So my agenda, my goal is that you people go through after the session, will be able to answer these different scenarios. What might be the possible cause with respect to blood collection? So in any sample, whether it is blood, urine, or histopathology specimen, it goes through a lot of steps from the point of its origin before it is being reported. Finally, it goes through a lot of steps. It goes through a lot many hands also. If every person ignores or makes an error, then it will result in a blunder or erroneous report, which might get the attention. So it is not just one person's, it is a chain of people who are involved in the processing of the sample are responsible for the end result. So I will briefly tell about the analytical error rate. When I say analytical error rate, it is the analytical. It is when we are analyzing the sample or any analyte, for example, creatinine or a glucose. previously in late 1990s, it was done manually, and hence the reports we can see a lot many errors per million tests done. Nearly 16 lakhs, 1,62,000 errors per million tests done, and gradually it came to 40, even less than 1%, less than one error per million tests done right now. So the current day fact is much of the errors, the laboratory errors, what we think happens in the pre-analytical phase and pre-analytical phase. So it is not during the analysis, but it is during the sample collection, transportation, and the pre-analytical phase, which some in labs which might vary according to the specimen and for the test which is being processed. So if you can see here, more than 70 to 80% is because of the pre-analytical and pre-analytical. So let's address this. So the journey of 1,000 miles begin with one step, or you can say first step, as told by Lao Tzu on his famous book, Art of War. And so before going to a blood test in detail, a blood collection in detail, we need to know three things. So what are the prerequisites to take a blood sample? So whether the patient is in appropriate fasting state or not, whether the time is appropriate or not to collect the blood sample, because certain blood investigations require to be taken in a fasting state, or because of the biological rhythm, we need to take the sample at appropriate timing. Like for example, for parathyroid hormone, you need to collect the sample between 7 to 8 a.m. in a fasting state. So if you are doing cortisol testing, so you might be doing in the evening and in the morning. So you need to know at what time to take the sample, and you need to instruct the patient accordingly. And also, if it is about the taking the blood sample, it is also the container which is important. In which vacutainer you are going to take the sample. Pardon, any question? Okay. So it is also the container or the vacutainer which is very important, because we cannot take blood into any vacutainer which you desire or with the color you prefer and send it for a testing and expect a good results, a proper result. And also, if you have done all the first two steps correctly, but you fail to send the sample in a proper way, you can also encounter with a wrong results. So for any, as with any procedure, and while giving general instructions before taking blood sample, it is always better to explain the patient that what you are going to do, raise appropriate requisition form, and give a proper relevant information in the HIS or in the requisition form if you are sending manually, and take appropriate container and ensure that it is delivered timely to the lab. Well, I'm not going to make an expert in the collection of blood. It is a skill actually, but in the next 30 minutes or so, what I will be emphasizing is how you can, giving pointers so that you can better choose vacutainer, better choose the timing and the proper way of collection of sample. So if you see here, the sample is being collected in a lab, or the patient is standing. Although the person who is drawing the blood is wearing protective gloves and taking the sample, but if you see here, the patient himself is, instead of a tourniquet, he is holding his arm, and the patient is standing. So it can lead to lot many errors. First thing, there may be hemoconcentration, can lead to deranged values. So it is not a good way to collect blood sample. The patient should be at ease, and tourniquet should be tied at least a few inches above on the point of venipuncture side, and it should not be tied for more than a minute. If it's tied for more than a minute, then the coagulation cascade might get activated and your coagulation results might come erroneously, or it might lead to even hemolysis after drawing the sample. So other few points that you need to bear in mind before taking the sample or choosing the site is that it should not be from a IV cannula, inhaling IV cannula, or from a AV fistula, the arm with AV fistula, or with a arm with a lymphoedema, or with burns, or patients having excessive scarring on that particular site. So avoid those areas. It is always preferable to use a multi-sample needle because it gives easily you can change the vacutainers and you don't have to depend on the syringes to take appropriate volume. For example, if you need around 15 ml of blood and you have only 5 ml syringe, so you need to constantly change, right? And which might lead to on its own complications. But if you use a multi-sample needle, it's very easy to switch between the vacutainers and you can draw appropriate volume of blood. So what happens if the blood is not filled properly? So if you see here in this particular EDTA vacutainer, the blood is filled only about 0.5 ml. So this particular vacutainer has EDTA as a chelator, and this is made with an appropriate ratio. So if the blood is less, the EDTA chelator, the salt will be excess and can lead to aggregation of platelets, resulting in pseudothrombocytopenia. So in each vacutainer, if you see, there are markings appropriate to which the blood has to be filled. So if you are using a multi-sample needle and a vacutainer, the exact amount of blood will be, and the tube is not expired, so appropriate amount of blood will automatically get into the vacutainer. If you are using a syringe, then it may lead to problems because you might underfill or overfill. So there are many variables which impact your analytical outcomes. So one of them I already told is the hemolysis, and another is if the sample is not stored properly, and also the type of additive. The vacutainer, if it is not properly used, can result in wrong results. Also delay in the processing time. And frequently, if you are into research or if you have stored the sample for research, and you are doing you are planned one marker today and another marker you will be doing like 1 month or 2 months later, and you are using the same aliquot of the sample. So the particular sample has undergone many freeze-thaw cycles, and it can lead to degeneration of those particular analyte, and that might give you erroneous values, low values, so that you cannot rely on the results that you are going to get. So it is avoid repeated freeze-thaw cycles. And if you plan to do analysis at different point of time, so better take different aliquots, better make different aliquots in the beginning only. The correct way of order of draw is very important, and the first should always be for the blood culture. So how to collect sample for blood culture will be in detail will be taken in the next class by Dr. Richa Mishra on the microbiology aspects. So once the sample venipuncture site is properly cleaned, if the patient is having coagulation test, and it should be the first one or first tube to be filled, because prolonged tourniquet or prolonged venous stasis can result in activation of the platelets, even release of certain coagulation factors, which can activate the clotting factors. So resulting in erroneous coagulation values, especially PT, prothrombin time. After the citrated vial, you should always concentrate on, there is nothing to memorize by heart this order of draw. It is just you have to apply your common sense. So citrate is always first, because if there is no blood culture, use citrate, because the platelet get activated or coagulation cascade can get activated. And then you go for tubes which does not contain any additive, whether it is red tube or the yellow tube. Red tube does not contain any gel, which serum separator gel we say. After centrifugation, it forms a different layer. It forms a layer between the serum and the blood components. So it is the plain containers, and then you go for heparin, and then you go for EDTA like CBC or hemogram, and then you will be going for the fluoride vial for glucose testing. See, if you reverse the order of draw, for what happens, sir, if I take blood from EDTA first and then in the plain tube. See, EDTA, as I told you, is a very strong chelator, and even a small amount of that salt gets into the needle, and then it is inserted into a serum tube. So this will chelate the calcium ions as well as magnesium ions in the blood. And this EDTA is actually a dipotassium salt. So the potassium will go high in the samples. So you will have a spuriously high potassium, low calcium, and low or undetectable alkaline phosphatase if EDTA sample is drawn first before the serum sample. So the order of draw goes from left to right. And after the drawing of the sample, it is how to send the sample or storage of sample. So storage for if you store any sample for especially if it's for a CBC sample, CBC investigation, if it is stored for more than 6 hours, then there are morphological changes that we are going to expect that are going to come encounter during the analysis. The RBC starts to swell and hence the PCV and MCV will be increased and also ESR. While the platelets will, as I told you, will go clumping and the TLC will also get decreased and reticulocytes, because it is standing there at room temperature, will start to mature and convert it into RBCs. So we will be having low reticulocyte count. It doesn't mean that you have to store every sample in fridge, because if, for example, you are taken a sample for coagulation studies and you have refrigerated the sample and you have sent it for a lab. So don't expect a proper results, because in cold conditions, the platelet gets activated and there will be loss of some labile factors, that is factor 5 and factor 8 especially, and lead to prolonged prothrombin and APTT values. So it might give a false diagnosis of hemophilia or von Willebrand disease depending on what you're working up and the clinical history. So it is not that every sample needs to be frozen or refrigerated or left in a room temperature. So you need to refer to appropriate guidelines or the literature so that you better know how to store the sample. So the scenarios which I shown in the beginning, you can answer them easily. Can anyone answer the scenario 1? Anybody? So scenario 1, the hemolysis, because the only potassium is risen, while clinically it is not correlating. So when we closely examine the sample, that it is, when we examined it, it was a hemolytic sample, and even the LDH was high in that particular sample. So it was because of a hemolysis. And the second sample is a classic example of wrong order of draw. I've already emphasized during the slide. And the third scenario, in which creatinine has suddenly shot up while the urea has remained same, it is because of the patient was on fenofibrate and the history was not given. And this actually fenofibrate is known to interfere with analytically, and we cannot do anything. Only thing is to avoid fenofibrate before getting the creatinine test done. It is due to inadequate mixing. The platelets thrombocytopenia has occurred because either it is inadequate mixing or low volume of the blood sample in the EDTA, because in both the cases, either the EDTA is excess or it has not been mixed with the platelets. In third scenario, it is due to underfilling, because you can see both APTT and PT results are high, or in when scenario 6, F1 is consistently low. So it might be because of the wrong tube, because it needs to be sent in a plain tube without any gel. If there is a gel, the drug gets entrapped within the gel while during centrifugation processing. So it does not get into the serum, or only low concentrations are available in the serum, giving erroneous values. So it is very important to know appropriate containers in which we have to take the sample. So in labs, we do reject specimens for various reasons, and most commonly it is because of hemolysis or wrongly barcoded or unlabeled or mislabeled. There is any discrepancy between the requisition and the specimen label, and if there isn't taken in a wrong tube. So there are certain pointers towards how to avoid hemolysis. It is better to use a clean apparatus and don't use a narrow gauge needle. And don't immediately centrifuge the sample. Try to settle, try to let the sample stand for a while before sending it. Don't place it immediately on a ice, so otherwise it will lead to hemolysis. and withdraw very slowly. And if you are using syringe and putting into a vacutainer, then push slowly. So certain tests, for example, which requires chilling, or if you are sending for ammonia or lactic acid, I mean parathyroid hormone, you need to send sample on ice. Certain specimens needs to be sent at 37 degrees only. And like for if you're evaluating for cold agglutinins, cryofibrillins, and cryoglobulins, and certain tests require protection from light. For example, bilirubin and all vitamin levels. You might come across low vitamin D levels across many patients. If you are getting, especially if the patients are coming getting tested from outside private laboratories. One probable cause for this is most of these labs don't process this, especially the vitamin D test in their own in-house, and they send it for some other lab, central lab, some bigger lab. So during transportation, these conditions are their samples are not protected from light and can lead to lysis of vitamin D and giving erroneously low vitamin D levels. So another most common specimen that you send for investigations routinely are urine samples, and urine can be collected on different times, whether it is a spot urine or a timed collection, a random specimen that is a 3 to 4 hour after the patient has last urinated. So timed urines can be a 1 to 2 hour collection or a 24-hour collection. So random urine, it is better to send it in a clean container. People send, we use all kinds of containers available at their home. It is better to purchase from medical stationery and send it, and always cover the specimen because there will be loss of carbon dioxide and there will be bacterial overgrowth. So what happens if there is a change in pH? So the change in pH, there are certain crystals which are only can be seen in acidic pH or an alkaline pH. If the pH is changed, then these crystals get dissolved into the urine and cannot be visualized under the microscope. So you might miss those stones from the urine report. And it is better to send freshly wadded specimens if you are planning to look if there are any RBCs and WBCs if you are expecting. For 24-hour urine collection, it is better to give a clear instruction to the patient, and it should be taken in a clean container and with preservative. The preservative changes are depending on what investigation that you are getting done from that specimen, whether it is 24-hour calcium, oxalate, or 24-hour protein or creatinine. Most of the time, these routine tests does not require any preservative, but if you are going for any trace elements in this thing, then they need a preservative. For that, patients need to visit the lab or the collection center and get a container with a preservative. Patient needs to be instructed to note down the time of the last voided, and then you should give the sample after voiding the next day. I did not submit all the collected urine to the lab. He might, if he's educated and at least good enough to know the volume that he has collected, if he is noted down, it's fine, and give an aliquot of around 20 to 30 ml to the lab. So you can find information regarding the containers and what are the prerequisites for collection and how to transport the specimens by visiting this website, which is maintained by American Association of Clinical Chemistry, and that is lab test online, and you get various information from this website. If you are in doubt, it is better to visit and get to know before sending any sample. So in the pathology, we do cytopathological reports also, and in cytopathology, which includes not only fine needle aspirates and guided FNAs, but we also do sputum, fluid, and squash cytology. Squash and imprint are interoperative cytology, and also we receive samples for pap smears, cervical pap smears. We do review cytology slides from outside. However, there are certain conditions. We'll say about it later. So fine needle aspirations are performed in the pathology department between 10 to 5 p.m. on weekdays and weekends. On Saturday, it is from 10 to 1 p.m. The clinicians, it is better if you mark the lymph node or swelling from which you want the FNAs to be done, and please mention the HIV status of the patient before sending. If it is not, the status is not known, better to get it done that one first and the FNAC later. And guided FNAC is done in the Department of Radiology on Mondays and Thursdays with appointment, and there is separate forms for USG and CT guided. If you have to do on your own, so use a plunger and fix the swelling or a lymph node of interest from where you want to take the specimen with your fingers as shown in this picture, so that it does not move around and take the sample. So it is good to make immediately smears from on a clean available slide and make a smear out of it, and should allow it to air dry. Whatever the extra material is there in the needle, you can express it in another container, which can be sent to a lab also. And after the slides are air dried, you have to send it in a alcohol fixed with proper labeling. So if you try to raise a FNAC request in HIS, it asks for certain mandatory information, whether clinical information or physical examination, lab results, and other findings. And it is better to give. It is always better to give the appropriate details. So it will help the pathologist in giving a report earlier. So they are mandatory, without which you cannot proceed for the raising the request. However, many times we come across just a dash being mentioned there. So since it's a software, it does not know what you have written. So if something is filled, and it allows you to go forward. So in fluid cytology, we do get various fluids for cytology, be it urine or serous cavity fluids. It is better to send in appropriate quantity, like in 100 ml. Of course, in CSF, you cannot send that much. So around 2 to 5 ml will be enough. So send a fresh specimen. If you cannot send it immediately, store at 4 degrees. But bear in mind, if you are planning to send for culture also, then don't store the specimen. So that will be a different. And you should label it properly. If a delay is unexpected, then that is for more than 6 hours. So put equal amount of ethanol. That is 50% ethanol. And you can add anticoagulants also. If you are sending like synovial fluid or ascitic fluid, which is 2 turbid, you can add 5 to 10 units of heparin or ml of fluid, or you can send it in a EDTA container also, Accutane. So for sputum cytology, it is always better to have a spontaneous deep cough sputum, and optimal time is between 15 to 30 minutes after getting up, and brushing the teeth and rinsing of mouth before giving the sputum sample will reduce the contamination by the saliva. 3 successive specimens, the fresh sample is to be sent in a wide mouth sterile bottle, while the other 2 specimens need to be sent in a Copeland jar containing 95% ethanol. So same with the pap smear also, it needs to be sent in ethanol. And for review of cytology slides from which have been reported from outside, we need a copy of the previous report and the relevant clinical information before sending to us. So we do receive samples for intraoperative cytology, especially from neurosurgery, or for sparse cytology from glial tumors, or imprint cytology for from lymph nodes and from nodules of solid organs. So inform the lab that you are sending intraoperative cytology. Note down these CUG numbers if you don't know, the landline numbers, and it should be sent in a normal saline. Unlike the histopath specimens where you send in formalin, you should take care that it should be sent in normal saline, and mention the correct phone number or contact number of the resident, and send the form for the histology of the remaining tissue. So histology is also asked. So coming to histopathology lab, the golden rule is maintain up to 10 to 20 times the volume of the tissue that you are sending, a resected specimen, with formalin. That is 10% buffer formalin. Fasten the lid securely, because most of the times, by the time it reaches the lab, the formula has been leaked out or it is spilled over. So it is better to identify the margins of interest with a suture or ink, and also mark the distal or proximal ends with the help of sutures, and give proper indications, and give the label the specimen, the container with the details of the patient name, CR number, and the tissue being sent, and please don't write it on the lid. So what happens here, we do get samples in various containers. If you see here, we have got in a DNS saline sample also, saline bottle also. And if you see here, it is nicely labeled, but it is underfilled. The specimen is too large for the amount of formalin which is there. While the other container, the label has gone out. Probably the formalin was leaking out, and then has taken out the labeling. While in the another container, on the blue cap container, you can see that is nicely labeled and formalin is there, but the specimen is not at all there. So it's an empty container. For us, it is an empty container. So use appropriate containers and appropriate volume, that is at least 10 to 20 times. And if it is a very huge organ or a hollow organ, try to make incisions so that the formalin gets into it and fixes them properly. And please don't refrigerate the sample because it leads to a lot of artifactual changes and makes difficult while interpretation, while doing reporting. So this was one of the cases while reporting from a lung biopsy specimen, and you can see many white dust-like, refractile dots-like things on the microscope, and so this might be because and there is a infiltration also. So it might be because of silicosis, but without a clinical history of a patient whether is exposed to any particles or not, so we cannot give a diagnosis. And also this can be because of artifactual changes also. So we cannot be sure whether it is an artifactual change or because patient has exposure to any dust. So when we looked at the form, there was mandatory information was left totally blank. So they had just put a hyphen over there, dash over there, and we could not get the clinical history. And later, when we called up the patient, we came to know the patient works in some chemical powder manufacturing factory. So this resulted in unnecessary delay in reporting the results. For intraoperative diagnosis, we do get samples for frozen section. Inform the lab beforehand before sending frozen section, and again send it in normal saline. Mark with suture, and mark whether it is a proximal. If you are sending, for example, Hirschsprung's disease, and you are sending a gut, so make sure to mark which one is the proximal end and which one is the distal end, and transport it immediately. Mention your CG number or extension of the OT that you are in, and please realize the limitations. We cannot give a conclusive diagnosis based on a frozen section, but however, it can help you in whether the margin is involved or not, the tumor or the neurons are there or not. So depending on what kind of request it is, so the conclusive report will come only after you send it for routine histopathology. We do get samples for review from outside. So in this review from outside, again, the previous report needs to be mentioned and proper relevant information needs to be mentioned. We might not be able to perform IHC on these specimens if there are no on the slides. If they are given the blocks, then we might. So we do get rapid processing requests, especially for renal transplant biopsies. And immunofluorescence and immunohistochemistry lab. So send a separate requisition form apart from the histology requisition form. And as I told you, it cannot be performed on a review slides, and a wax block is a must to perform on a review slide. For immunofluorescence, give you proper details, whether it is for example, if it is from a nephrology, mention whether it is a transplant kidney or a native kidney, and send again in a normal saline or a transport medium. and mention the investigation that you are interested in, whether it is IgG, IgM, IgA, C3, C1q, and C4d. We have electron microscopy lab also in our department, and one of the prerequisite for this is that the sample needs to be sent in a cold collateral bed fixating only, and you can get it from the electron microscopy lab, the pathology in the ground floor, and inform the lab, get the vial, and send it immediately or as early as possible. So in conclusion is that lot many things can go wrong if everybody is ignorant of their roles. So instead of blaming on each other, it is better to work as a team and provide information. If somebody has done any mistake or some error, educate them and assess repeatedly. If you are a supervisor, assess the competency. For example, the nurses who is drawing the sample, how it is being sent, and if action is necessary, take some appropriate actions and remediate if necessary. So thank you.